later.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. Tzoraim Tovim. I'm Carnie Rose. I am the Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Emunah, and I'm joined today, of course, once again by Rabbi Daniel Bogard of Central Reform, Rabbi Jim Bennett, my neighbor at Shar Emeth, and of course, Maharat Rori Neiss, who serves at the JCRC. And we're delighted to be with you for the third of a series of 4 conversations amongst the 4 of us. And I want to thank all of those of you who shared comments and feelings and feedback. And we're very excited to be able to spend this session with you. Today's session is going to move us in a slightly different direction and a slightly different modality. Anybody who knows me I like to move in different directions and in different modalities. So I thought we'd try something a little different. I want to thank Rabbi Bogard in particular, who's really been the Zoom angel, because his technological know-how along with Maharat Rori has enabled us to do this. It's a great indication of the fact that some of us are a little older than others, and some of us are a little more adept at the technology. But so far, it's been really a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate all of the feedback that we've all been receiving in the community at large. Today's session is going to focus in on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and the relationship between the two. And the modality in which I'd like to try to do this is by showing a series of short clips, some a little shorter than others, some a little longer than others, and then to have the folks who are here, the panelists, reflect on these particular Zoom, I guess they're going to come to us by Zoom, clips. Some are from YouTube, some are lectures from the Hartman Institute. And as I mentioned, the Hartman Institute, I just want to acknowledge our gratitude to the Hartman Institute, not only for the training that each of us received as fellows at the Hartman Institute, but for their ongoing inspiration in providing curriculum and thought material for all of us to chew on so that we can continue to provide guidance and direction, illumination, and edification for our various communities. So we're going to start with a little clip on anti-Semitism. And then I'm going to ask each of the panelists to kind of reflect on their own experiences of anti-Semitism. Do they resonate with the clip that they're seeing? Do they not resonate? And Be'ezrat Hashem, with God's help, people have been asking for it already in the chat. Hopefully we'll get a little controversial today. So we're looking forward to the conversation. Without any further ado, Rabbi Bogard, if you would work your magic, please.
It would be a grave mistake to view anti-Semitism as something that merely affects the Jewish people. Anti-Semitism is a form of discrimination against citizens that affects all of us. You do see anti-Semitism correlating with an intolerance generally. That is fundamentally going to constitute a threat to the kind of discourse and tolerance that are the bedrock of our democracies.
Historians of anti-Semitism have long argued that anti-Semitism, it begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. It transcends place, it transcends nationality. We can document anti-Semitic attacks through the Middle Ages, and we can document them certainly in the 20th century, and now we can document them in the 21st century. It has legs that I think other hatreds haven't had.
Unfortunately, we are facing in Europe, all over Europe, a very strong resurgence of anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism today is fundamentally different than what it was before the Holocaust, because it is not perpetrated by governments. Even if some of the stereotypes and prejudice are those we know for centuries.
The problem is that in our Muslim communities in Europe, we have a few thousands of radicalized youth. These jihadists are rabidly anti-Semitic. We never know whether they are going to cross the red line of terrorism, and some do. Often their targets are Jewish institutions or Jews.
We see across Europe an increase of right-wing extremist parties. These parties are not anymore considered as being on the fringe of societies. And their messages, their ideologies are more and more seen as something that is acceptable.
Sometimes it's camouflaged by, we don't want those who are different, a general anti-immigrant, anti-minority view.
You have as well a new form of anti-Semitism that is closely linked with anti-Zionism and hostility towards Israel. There is legitimate criticism of the policies of Israel, but there is a fine line that some people cross very easily between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism.
Where it gets very problematic is when one starts to hear that the state of Israel doesn't have the right to exist, when one starts to hear Israelis or Israel itself being demonized, and the concerted effort to delegitimate the state and the people. That is anti-Semitism.
I think that most of the anti-Semitism in the Middle East is misinformed. It is to group people against a common enemy.
Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. The only reason to deny the Holocaust is to inculcate and foster anti-Semitism. One place where hardcore denial is very much in vogue is in the Middle East. The audience often are anti-Semites who are looking to have their feelings confirmed, or people who might not be overt anti-Semites, but somehow are discomforted with the idea of Jew as victim.
I think for anyone, anti-Semitism should be an important topic and subject. If it's going on in Pakistan, it should be important to someone living in Kansas City. We are a connected global community.
If you leave anti-Semitism unresponded to by law enforcement, by governments, by political leaders, then you send this message that it's tolerated, that it's completely accepted.
What you're seeing now is states, at least in Europe, where there's been the biggest upsurge, seeking to combat those crimes. More needs to be done.
We'll stand together against discrimination against minority, with Christians, or anti-Semitism. We stand together shoulder to shoulder because our religion, all of us, call us to stand as one family.
It is extremely important that parts of our society that aren't themselves being targeted by anti-Semitism see this as a warning. When anti-Semitic discrimination or violent acts happen, it is a threat to liberal society, and citizens around the world have an interest in thwarting it and in speaking out against it.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, you're all had the opportunity to see that short clip, a powerful one. I was going to ask our panelists just to spend a moment or two reflecting on what it is that you saw. Do you resonate with what you saw? Was there something in particular that was meaningful to you? And also, if we could try to make it a little bit more personal, if you yourself have experienced anti-Semitism in recent times, maybe you want to go back a little further, but in recent times. So I'm going to go around. I don't know who wants to go first, but please jump in. All at once.
I guess I'm happy to go with a reflection on anti-Semitism. You know, I feel like I spent a good part of the beginning of my rabbinic career talking a lot about not how we have to get past anti-Semitism, but how we can't let anti-Semitism continue to be the defining feature of our lives, or our Jewish lives is what I really mean. That the vast majority of American Jews who were my age or generationally close to me have really grown up in an America where it's not anti-Semitism is not something, or had not been something widespread that we encountered. It felt like often something that was used by people who are invested in trying to utz on Jewish identity, using anti-Semitism as a tool of that, which I found and continue to find objectionable and deeply problematic. And then I have experienced more anti-Semitism in the last 4 years than I can't ignore it anymore. I end up on a list of Jews to be targeted with online hate speech back in 2015, 2016. Right, look, I'm very clear. I don't think this can be disconnected from the rise of Donald Trump and that movement. I see Trumpism as a fundamentally bigoted white supremacist movement, and see white supremacy as being having anti-Semitism right at its core, much like the work of Eric Ward. I'd encourage people to read if you don't know him. But look, I ended up on this list. I have been on a train. I was leaving the President's Prayer Breakfast in 2016, traveling to a friend for Shabbos, and had a man stop and look at me in my kippah and say, "This is not your country. This is not your world," and sat and stared at me until I got off the train, about as scared as I've ever been. And over again, things like this have happened. But again, I guess I was struck in that video seeing these clips of these European right-wing parties in the early, part of this decade, and looking around, and it just feels like our country now.
Others, please.
I mean, I'll echo much of what you said, Daniel, and at the same time say, while I have memories as a child of adolescent and pre-adolescent stupidity, feigning anti-Semitism in my own life. Somebody, when I was a young kid, calling me Jewish Jimmy and chasing me home from school and things of that sort, kind of these vague memories. I have to be perfectly candid and say that personally, I have lived a life like I think the lives of most of us in the United States and in most free countries, free of anti-Semitism personally, and also, quite frankly, blessed by both the good and the burden of Jewish privilege, of actually not knowing anti-Semitism. And I, like you, have long resisted the knee-jerk reaction to calling anything and everything anti-Semitism, and feeling that, we use that has, at least until recent times, been used as a tool to increase Jewish identity, as you said, to fundraise, to scare people into more loyalty to their Jewish community and faith, etc. At the same time, I think nobody whose eyes are open and whose ears are open and is paying attention can deny just what you say, the rise of right-wing extremism, the rise of hatred. I'm not sure, and this is where I personally am interested where you're going to take us, Carnie, today. I'm not sure that we should still go to anti-Semitism as the real problem. I think anti-Semitism personally is a symptom of a greater problem in our world today. And so I'm resistant, especially when we talk about criticism of Israel vis-a-vis anti-Semitism. I feel very strongly there, but even with all these others, I'm just not sure anti-Semitism is the real problem.
So there's a lot I want to reflect on in that clip. We could spend 3 hours, I think, just on that alone. And I'm grateful to you for bringing it to us. And I'm also, thinking about what some of my colleagues have said. I think it's interesting because for me, it's hard for me to comment on it more broadly as much as it is, I think, to be really introspective of it. And I think I was having a really hard time watching that clip because it was scary. It was incredibly scary to see the footage. And I'm also very aware of the fact, right, that we're picking out some clips. We could pick out different clips. I appreciate it also at the end where also, people holding up signs saying I am a Jew or I think about it just in my own experience of being in the JCR scene in our own community. Twice we've 3 times, I should say, we've gathered together after large-scale attacks, not necessarily, although, we had after the cemetery was desecrated, after the Tree of Life synagogue, and then after the shooting at Poway. And, what always struck me in each one was, there was like this fear that existed, right? Of like, how did we all feel when we heard the news, of there being a shooting at a synagogue, right? I mean, we all know that feeling. And then also like this feeling of what did it look like? And I had the privilege of standing on that stage and looking out and seeing 3,000 people in the audience who had gathered, who were elected officials, who were leaders of other faith traditions, people from and then I got stopped for like a week after the vigil at Tree of Life. I was getting stopped at Starbucks by people I had never met who said, I was there and I just want to say, it was great, thank you for being there. And so like we can tell two different stories in that, and I recognize that. I recognize you could tell two different stories, and I realize that they're both 100% true stories. And at the same time, for me, and I don't know if this was kind of reflective, I think, of what some others were saying, I grew up, and I think this was, again, like kind of a very typical maybe of like my age group, where so much of my Jewish education was heavily Holocaust education, right? I know there's been like a lot of research, but like, I still have nightmares. Like much of my childhood was sort of spent on like the waiting for them to come for us, because that was what was so instilled, right? There was this feeling in Jewish education of if we forget is when it's going to happen again, and we can never forget. And I learned at much too young an age, just stories. And I want to be very careful. I'm not at all saying that we shouldn't be teaching our children about the Holocaust, right? But I'm saying for myself, I feel like it was given to me not in a way that was really healthy for me. And so I find myself resistant to this narrative, right? I'm not saying it's not a true narrative, but for me, there's also a certain feeling of like, what do I need so I can get out of bed in the morning? And for me, there's sort of a balance, right, of like, how aware do we need to be of anti-Semitism? And at the same time, like how much hope, because there's a point at which you just don't ever get out from under the covers. And so that's not totally a reflection on like what's actually happening in the world, but also like what do I need so I can actually continue to do this work? Because if all the clips are just overwhelmingly hopeless, then I don't know how we even, I don't know how we leave the house.
Yeah. Thank you. That's wonderful. I want to share just a couple of pieces myself. The first is that when I came to B'nai Yamuna, Rabbi Lipnick was not particularly good with technology. He was really a Luddite. And he would have difficulties. And every time he would have a problem with a piece of machinery, he would say, it must be anti-Semitism, right? It must be anti-Semitism. And if his phone didn't work, it was anti-Semitism. And it was interesting to me because he was a person who really had lived through a time when he really understood what anti-Semitism looked like, right? I mean, classic anti-Semitism. Yet on the other hand, he was able to kind of look at it from a different perspective and sort of tongue-in-cheek say, my telephone not working, my technology not working is a form of anti-Semitism. I think, though, that the last few years have really been game changers for us. I think others have said it here too. That I remember sitting at CLAL, the Center for Leadership and Learning, and sitting with Erwin Kula, our teacher and our friend, and Rabbi Kula saying, I don't know what's going to perpetuate people going forward because this anti-Semitism is going to disappear. In fact, what's going to kill us is philo-Semitism, right? The love of the Jewish people is going to kill us. And the truth of the matter is that we have absolutely seen a rise in anti-Semitism. Nobody can claim otherwise. Maybe it's overinflated because we live in a world where there's a news cycle all the time and we can watch clips from all over the world as the one we just saw right now. But one way or another, there seems to be a rise. But I want to make sure that I'm echoing what others have said already, that this cannot be the defining factor for us. And so the question became for us and becomes for us, what will be the defining factor, right? What will it be that will define us as a people and be the reason to get out of bed in the morning, right? To continue to do the work, to continue to live Jewish life. And so, of course, I think the next step that I want to take us on is the step of going to the state of Israel. That Zionism became, right, the state of Israel. This notion of creating a Jewish homeland in our ancestral homeland is, I think, the next great attempt at the unifying factors, right? We want to be one people. And can Zionism be the unifying factor, right? And the fight against anti-Semitism takes the shape now of a place where we call our own, we can defend ourselves, and therefore can be the place that defends all Jews in a time when there still is anti-Semitism. One call it a post-anti-Semitic reality, but what will be the next iteration? At least for me, my experience was that became Zionut, that became Zionism. So I want to throw up the next clip, and we'll see where we're going. The voice that you'll hear should be a voice that's familiar to you. This is the voice of the Grand Chief Rabbi of the British Commonwealth, and you'll hear his voice in just a moment. It's kind of a cute, cartoony, but there's a lot here, okay? So this is the notion of the next step in this move from anti-Semitism and the battling of anti-Semitism to Zionism sort of being the remedy, the prescription for addressing it.
How can anti-Zionism be the new anti-Semitism? Surely there's no connection between them. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews as a people, a race, an ethnic group. Anti-Zionism is an objection to a country, a nation, a state. What's the connection between them? Anti-Semitism is a virus that mutates, so that new anti-Semites can deny that they're anti-Semites at all, because their hate is different from the old. In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated for their religion. In the 19th and early 20th century, they were hated for their race. Today, they are hated for their nation-state, Israel. What all three have in common is that there are different ways of saying that Jews have no right to exist collectively as Jews with the same rights as other human beings. In each era, anti-Semitism has focused on the primary form of collective Jewish existence. In the Middle Ages, they were a religious community, so they were hated for their religion. In the 19th century, when many European Jews became secular, they formed an ethnic group, a race, and were hated as such. Today, when their primary collective embodiment is as the people of Israel in the state of Israel, they are hated for their state. Anti-Zionism is the latest mutation of the world's longest hate. What then is the connection between Jews as a people, Judaism as a religion, and Israel as a state? The connection between the Jewish people and Israel goes back long before the birth of either Islam or Christianity. Jews created a society there in the days of Joshua, a kingdom in the days of Saul, and a nation with Jerusalem as its capital in the days of King David. All of this more than 3,000 years ago. Jews are the only people who ever created a nation-state there. At all other times in the past 3,000 years, it was merely an administrative district in an empire whose center was elsewhere. The Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Alexandrian, Roman, and Byzantine empires, the Crusaders of the Holy Roman Empire, the various Muslim empires, such as the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Fatimids, the Mamluks, and the Ottomans, until finally the British. Jews are the only people who have maintained a continuous presence in the land. They are its indigenous, original inhabitants. The November 1947 United Nations vote to bring Israel into existence was a momentous reversal of imperialism. It gave back to the Jewish people the home taken from them by empire after empire. Israel was the only non-artificial creation in the Middle East after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The rest, among them Jordan, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, were all artificial creations that hadn't been states before, which is why most of them still exist in a condition of ethnic, religious, and tribal strife. Only Israel had previously existed as a nation-state. That's the unbreakable connection between Israel and the Jewish people. The connection between Israel and Judaism is equally ancient and fundamental. It's more than just, as Robert Frost said, home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. Read the Hebrew Bible and you'll see immediately that it isn't about the salvation of the soul. It's about creating in the Holy Land a society based on biblical ideas of justice, welfare, the sanctity of life, and caring for the stranger because you know what it feels like to be a stranger. Judaism began with two journeys to the land, one by Abraham and Sarah, the other by the Israelites in the days of Moses. At least half of the 613 commandments of the Bible are only applicable to the land of Israel. And though in the centuries of exile and dispersion, Jews lived in almost every land under the sun, Israel has remained a focus of their prayers and the only place where they've been able to do what every other nation takes for granted, construct their own society in the light of their own ideals. Judaism differs from the other Abrahamic monotheisms, Christianity and Islam, in that it's the only one of the three that never created or sought to create an empire. It was the imperialism of the Roman Emperor Hadrian that led him in the 2nd century to change the country's name to Palestine. One of the first, but certainly not the last, deliberate falsifications of history by those who seek to deny the Jewish people's right to their land. There are 56 Islamic nations and 159 in which Christians form the majority. There is, and only ever has been, one Jewish state, tiny and vulnerable, though it is and always was. That's why anti-Zionism, denying Jews the right to their one and only collective home by misrepresenting Judaism, is the new anti-Semitism, every bit as virulent and dangerous as the old.
Thank you, Rabbi Bogard. Panelists, reactions to Rabbi Sachs, as I put in the chat, wonderful mind, and what an accent, boy, just a wonderful accent. And I think their artistry was quite cute as well. So, reactions to what you just saw.
Look, I'll start. I can't, nobody can deny Rabbi Sachs's pedigree and his credentials and his wisdom and his insight and his beautiful British accent and all the things that are attributes that are deserved. I have to just say, and I'm going to be a little provocative here, I don't buy it, personally. I don't buy it. First of all, and this is my first problem that I just want to put on the table here, I don't agree with his premise that the Jewish people are the true indigenous people in this land. And I don't think the Torah agrees with that either. I mean, if you go back to Genesis chapter 12, Abraham was told to come to a land that God sent him to, and there were already people living in that land. And we can debate whether the people living there now who aren't Jews are the same descendants of the same peoples or not, but I think he skips over and foments one of the great fallacies of the Jewish claim to authentic right to being seen as the indigenous people in that land. Now, granted, I do agree that much of the hatred against the modern state of Israel is a virulent form of anti-Semitism, but I'm not sure it automatically is. And I think he oversimplifies and he gives people really, really beautiful sounding talking points to fall back on that actually does us a disservice because it gets us to stop thinking and just claiming that we're victims when in fact we may not be. So I'll stop there for now.
So
That was good.
I'd actually, I want to jump in on this because I want to take it in. Sorry, I'm trying to organize my thoughts, but I'm feeling really excited about it. So I wanted to jump in. So because what I don't want to do, and I mean, if others want to, we can obviously go that direction. You know, I just feel like this isn't helpful to get into like the entire history of, you know, the British mandate, like all of those things. I think many people know it. There's other ways to kind of go, and I think we can. I also think we can get caught up in facts. Everyone's going to have kind of facts in various ways and things like that, you know. And so for me, I actually want to take this conversation, like, to go back to where you started us, Carnie, in terms of anti-Semitism, to then say, okay, like, how do we then parse out when anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism? Because I think there were points in this video when that's true, but I think that it was an oversimplification to then say, right, so like anti-Zionism could be a new version of anti-Semitism, but I don't agree that all anti-Zionist rhetoric is inherently then anti-Semitic. And in that, I want to go back, and I don't remember now who it was in the first video. I know Deborah Lipstadt had said anti-Semitism starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews, and I think Samantha Powers might have also brought it up.
Yes.
I think there's like a question of, and I actually wrote an op-ed about this, maybe it was a year or so ago. I can't remember why. There was some debate that was happening about anti-Semitism that I'd gotten caught up in. And this idea of, like, you know, are all attacks against Jews anti-Semitic, right? And specifically, like somebody was posing the question, right? If someone mugs somebody on the street and the person is Jewish, this person was arguing that's anti-Semitic. And I was arguing it wasn't. If this person didn't know this person was Jewish, this person thought they were mugging somebody, then that's not an anti-Semitic act, right? It's a crime, it's a violent crime, but it's not anti-Semitic, right? And by the way, I'd also say, right, I do think it's interesting, and we've seen, and this is the ways that the Jewish community has integrated in society. There are people who are victims of anti-Semitism who are not Jews, right? When 3 Christians were killed outside the JCC in Kansas City, they were victims of anti-Semitism. When the African-American guard at the Holocaust Museum was murdered, that was a victim of anti-Semitism. When Jews were killed because they tried to register Blacks in the South to vote, they were victims of racism, right? It's not about, it's about kind of the intention, and it's about what the hatred is coming from, I think, of the person, than it is about kind of the identity of the person itself. And so in that, I think we need to be really careful of saying like that and I think this came up in your first video, right? Anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews for being Jews, right? And so in that, I also want to say, right, like if somebody meets somebody who's Jewish, who's terrible to them, and they hate that person, I'm not kind of advocating, right? But like, I don't think that's anti-Semitism, right? They don't like that person because they cheated them in business, or they don't like that person because you know, they're a bad neighbor, right? Whatever it is, right? Like we need to kind of, right? So for all the jokes, and I think I share Rabbi Lipnick's sense of humor sometimes. I have a friend, right? You know, if a TV show is on at the wrong time, you know, we're like, well, that's anti-Semitism, right? Like, but I think we say it because it's been used so flippantly. And so in that, I want to say, I think if the hatred, if the anti-Zionism is a hatred of Israel because it is a Jewish state, if it is a denial of Jewish ability to claim our history, to be involved in this process that the rest of the world is involved in, then I'm willing to see that as an iteration of it. But just like I think people can legitimately criticize Jews for being bad at their jobs, people can legitimately criticize Jews for cutting them off when they're driving, people can legitimately, right? So too, we need to be able to legitimately criticize Israel when Israel does something wrong. And a criticism or a dislike of Israeli policies, or a dislike of Israel as a country, I don't think is inherently anti-Semitic, unless it is a hatred because it is a Jewish country and stemming from a hatred of Jews.
So we will advise Rabbi Sachs that you disagree with his final comment, or you agreed with many other pieces that he had to say.
I agree with some of his points. I would say I do agree with Jim's point. I think he oversimplified. And I understand because it was sort of a cartoon, you know, I mean, he's trying to make a point. I think it was a gross oversimplification of what's ultimately an incredibly complicated system. And that I mean, I don't agree. I want to lift up the parts of Jim's points that I agree. I don't agree with every part of what you said, just to make sure people understand we're not always agreeing. But I think we do ourselves a disservice, right? So what are the ways in which we shut down conversations, or what are the ways? And again, I want to say this also in terms of anti-Semitism, right? Like, if people have issues with something that we do as a Jewish community, that's part of, like, we can engage in dialogue about that. I don't think it's inherently anti-Semitic unless it is specifically about like a hatred of Jews for doing what we do as Jews, right? Like, Jews are part of, I think, like we talked about this in a previous week, and then I'll stop. I'm sorry, I know I'm on my soapbox, but I think part of what it is for us to sort of be like accepted as Jews is to be normal like everyone else, which also means we can also do annoying things like everyone else. Right? I think that's actually the problem in some ways with philo-Semitism. We don't want to be hated and we don't want to be loved. We want you to like us if we did something nice and be mad at us if we pissed you off. Like, we just want to be like everybody else in that regard.
And so the question I'm just going to add, and then Rabbi Bogard, I know, is ready to jump in as well, just to say, is that true as well about the state of Israel? In other words, can we love Israel when Israel is deserving of, in our orientation to the world, of love and praise? And can we chastise and criticize and be disappointed with Israel in the moments when Israel disappoints us? And again, depending on our orientation. And when we do that, is that considered to be a form of anti-Semitism? So, Rabbi Bogard, please.
Look, I'll start by saying I'm resonating very much with what Jim and Rori said, particularly. I personally found this video to be problematic. It felt like Hasbara to me, like propaganda, right? But the other piece that really stood out to me was actually, it struck me that it felt like Rabbi Sachs was denying my Jewish identity. That he has this conception of Judaism as being like the experience that he has in Britain and Israel, and that Israel becomes the center. But the reality is, for North American Jews, the vast majority of North American Jews, particularly American USA Jews, our experience has not been that we are fundamentally living in diaspora. Our experience has been that we are fundamentally at home in our society. And at least the way I conceive of sort of my identity is that there are two great centers of Jewish life today. There are two great Jewish civilizations. Basically, there's the 40% of us that live in North America, and there's the 40% of us that live in Israel. But going back to something Rori said earlier, building off of it, right? For a whole generation or a couple generations of many American Jews in particular, I think our Jewish identity was actually replaced with Holocaustism, is sort of what Rori was getting at to a large extent. But I actually think to a huge extent, inclusive of my generation, it was also replaced by Israelism, where a proxy identity to the nation of Israel and to the Zionist movement, the Zionist project. I say this as someone who feels deeply connected to both of those things, right? In many ways took the center of our Jewish identities rather than Judaism, rather than Jewish values, rather than, and I think there's some really understandable reasons for that, right? Living in the shadow of the Holocaust and in a moment of Yavne where we have built a new Jewish society for the first time in thousands of years. Yeah.
So I'd like to try to push the conversation a little further, and we're going to skip ahead a little bit, because one of the conversations, of course, that we're having here, at least in part, it's an undertow, and I think it was clearly available to us in the conversation or the little cartoon that we heard from Rabbi Sachs, is that this is a virus, right? Anti-Semitism is a virus, and therefore it infects all of us, and any form of anti-Semitism ultimately will be a way in which to, or let's put it this way, any form of criticism of Jews or of the state of the Jews, of the state of Israel, is a form of anti-Semitism. That really is his conclusion. If you listen to it, at least as I listen to it, that's what I hear. And so many people say to me, well, don't all Jews support the state of Israel, right? And the answer is, of course, no. And so what I wanted to show us here are two little clips. I'm going to ask Mr. Magic over there, Rabbi Magic Daniel, is going to give us clip number 4. These are the Neturei Karta. These are clearly Jews, right? But you have to hear what they have to say, and that'll be followed by clip number 5, which is Jewish Voices for Peace, or for a just peace, right? So let's listen to these two clips, and then we'll come back and we'll reflect on these orientations to the question of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism.
We are here attending the Mass ICNA convention in Chicago, we are participating here. We have a booth here, and our mission is to explain to so many people, the Muslim people here, and to the world at large, that not all Jews support the State of Israel. There's a great difference between Judaism and Zionism. Judaism is a religion, the Jewish people practicing this religion only, versus Zionism, the State of Israel, which is a purely political movement. We are handing out this new pamphlet which is talking about the recent President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of the State of Israel. And we say that according to Jewish religion, this is unacceptable. It's not just the question of Jerusalem, it's the question of entire Palestine. This entire occupation is unacceptable according to Judaism. And we have masses of Jewish people worldwide who totally oppose all what the State of Israel stands for. All the State of Israel stands for is in total contradiction, in total violation of Jewish teachings, killing and stealing, occupying another's land, oppressing an entire people. All of this is totally forbidden according to Judaism. This is a true violation of Jewish teachings. And in addition, this concept of building a sovereign homeland for Jews happens to be in total contrast to Jewish belief. According to Judaism, we are in exile. Jewish people are forbidden to end exile by any physical means. All Jewish leaders from the very beginning of Zionism totally opposed this concept. This was invented not by religious scholars. The philosophy of Zionism, of building a sovereign homeland for Jews, was invented by Theodor Herzl and his friends, people who didn't follow anything within the Jewish religion.
Bogard, if we could go to number 5, that would be great too.
Thanks for having me. I represent a base of American Jews and the base of the Democratic Party who are calling on Democratic leaders to reject AIPAC and actually take meaningful action towards ending Israel's military occupation that deprives Palestinians of civil, political, and human rights. You know, I think it's clear that this generation of young American Jews knows that violating the rights of humans and children is wrong, whether it's at the border or whether it's taking kids out of bed in the middle of the night in the West Bank. And we're calling on our political leaders to actually represent that view. We're tired of the blank check that the Democratic Party has given to the Israeli government to continue the status quo in Israel, to continue dispossessing Palestinians of their land and of their lives. And I think, you know, we're ready as American Jews to stop ceding the territory and the arena of the political moment to an establishment that doesn't represent us or our views. Okay. And so we're asking politicians to actually take responsibility for this issue and put forward bold new solutions to end what is this injustice.
All right, so Haley, I mean, surely it's a good thing for young activists to hit the road and get the candidates to voice their opinions more clearly on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, isn't it? I mean, will you give, if not now, your blessing as they hit the road?
There's a very different approach from Emily's organization and ours, the Jewish Democratic Council of America. 2020 is going to be the most important election of our lifetime, and because of our values, we need to defeat Donald Trump. The way to do that is by rallying behind the strongest Democratic candidate to emerge after this very robust field that we now have in the primary, and to talk about issues that are driving the vote, where there is such a distinction between the Democratic perspective and that of Donald Trump. So whether it is access to affordable health care, or ending the epidemic of gun violence, or treating those on our borders humanely, these are the issues that we know voters want to hear about. These are the issues that will drive the vote, and that is the issue where there is the biggest distinction between Democrats and Republicans. Those are the issues that we will hear the candidates talking about on the trail.
Okay, so, you know, Emily, basically I think what Haley is saying, if I slightly paraphrase it, you know, why should this conflict be as high on the agenda as immigration, as climate change, as gun violence and other issues? Shouldn't those be what the Democratic Party really focuses on?
listen, I think the real issue here is, are Democrats going to distinguish themselves from Trump also on foreign policy and on the question of Israel-Palestine, right? There's no reason why Democrats shouldn't be putting forward as bold a vision on solving and ending Israel's military occupation as they are around healthcare and free college. And so what young Jews are asking is actually for Democrats to be consistent in their values. The vast majority of American Jews disapprove of Trump's approach to the Middle East and to Israel-Palestine. And so what we're asking is just for Democrats to actually apply the same values of democracy, freedom, and equality to Israel-Palestine than they would to the domestic sphere.
Yeah, Haley, I mean, I want you to respond to that. I mean, just because there are other issues that the party does need to deal with, it doesn't mean you have to neglect a major foreign policy issue like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
By no means am I saying we should neglect it. However, there is consensus among the Democratic candidates on key issues such as support for a two-state solution, support of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and opposition to the global BDS movement. There is consensus among the candidates on those issues, and by embracing a two-state solution, they are already distinguishing themselves from the policies put forward by this administration, which has even neglected to reference a two-state solution in its so-called peace plan. So there's a consensus. There's no need to create divisions where there otherwise do not exist. That's just playing into the Republican narrative. Donald Trump would like nothing more than to see Democrats divided on issues related to Israel. And the reality is that those divisions don't exist. So let's not try to create them.
See, I want to talk.
Very good. Thank you so much. Okay, probably we could spend the next, 10 years having this conversation. But reactions to those two videos, first and foremost, the notion that not all Jews are Zionists. And then, of course, the Jewish Voice for Peace, and then kind of distinguishing itself from the Jewish Democratic organization that Haley Sofer represents here. So reactions from our panelists, yeah.
I just want to be careful. So that wasn't actually Jewish Voice for Peace. That was If Not Now. So
sorry. I said Jewish Voice. I said If Not Now. I apologize. Thank you. So just reactions to what it is that you saw.
I'm grateful that you brought these two videos for us and all those watching this webinar. I think it's really important for us to know that the Jewish community is not monolithic when it comes to Israel, and for us to convey that. And frankly, while they both represent extremes, they are not illegitimate or unfounded extremes. Each of these extreme views, personally at least, I think have a right to their position, and we should not shout them down, which so often Jews do. It's kind of ironic. I've never in my life or my career found myself nodding my head yes to Neturei Karta, but actually, while I don't agree with them, I think they have a legitimate claim to a particular ideology about the state of Israel, particularly when this member of the Neturei Karta says Israel is not permitted to behave immorally towards the people living in the land. And I also think, quite frankly, we shout down If Not Now and other extreme left-wing groups of Jews who are passionate about their values and care deeply about being Jewish and about the moral character of the state of Israel. We do a disservice to them and to our entire community when we shout them down and write them out of existence. They have a point, and we should affirm their point, and we should listen and engage with them in meaningful dialogue.
I think in particular it was interesting that a very young person, right? It was a very young person, and I think more and more these are the voices that we're hearing from younger people in our communities and in our congregations who are echoing many of the sentiments that we heard, plus or minus, right? Whether it is exactly what the young woman said or not, or the slightly older, though she was not much older woman, have to say, right? These are notions that are circulating in our community, and to ignore them is to our own peril. It means that we're losing touch with a generation of our people who are making these determinations, I think not willy-nilly. I think these are making these determinations based on the educations that they have received within our institutions, within our organizations, within our training, the commitment and dedication to living just, moral, and ethical lives based on the teachings that we have tried to inculcate them with in our synagogues and in our schools.
Right.
So somebody posed the question of if we can share the links to all the videos. So I just wanted to say that I'm happy to send out an email after this with follow-up, and I'll include the links. So as long as you're all here, because you're on Zoom, so you've registered, so I have your email address. But if someone is listening to this later on, can get a hold of one of us. We're all pretty easy to find. So, look, I think for me, I certainly, like, I think for all of us, I shouldn't speak for everyone else, but, part of doing Jewish communal work is we're not only working with the people who we agree with, and I think that's a big part of community building. And I certainly, I did not, I don't agree with a lot of most of what was said in those clips. I didn't even like some of it. But I will say that I also don't like a lot of things that are said to me on a daily basis. And so I struggle with why it is that those are the voices that we have kicked out of the community, when there are voices in our community that say horribly racist or homophobic or Islamophobic or anti-Arab sentiments, or we can have a list of the things that I find offensive, and I'm sure other people will have a different list. And I might have brought it up differently. It's very easy. It's very easy for us to just carve out the people that we don't want to hear, and put them outside the fold, and then we only have to deal with those people inside the community. It'd be far easier for all of us to do that, but I don't think we have the luxury. I think especially tying it with everything else we've been talking about, as a small community that does experience anti-Semitism, I don't think we can afford to start to really self-divide our community in those ways. And so in that, I think, and I think this also plays in, I think this goes back to, I know Daniel just stepped up, but I think to what he was also saying before, I think it's important to recognize that, I think he's right. I think a big part of the American Jewish project for a period of time was really focused, and in many ways, I think we did away with, let me say this a little differently. I find it fascinating for all the people who kind of said, like, that the four of us are actually very much in line. I find it interesting because it depends on, like, pick a category and you can line us up, or you could put us widely across the spectrum. But as a Jewish community, we've sort of said, like, and I think it's beautiful. We've created these spaces and JCRCs and federations, where we want everyone, whatever that means, to be welcome. And so suddenly you don't have to keep Shabbat, and you don't have to keep Kashrut, and you don't have to belong to a synagogue, and you don't have to pray, you don't have to believe in God, you don't have to ascribe to theology, you don't have to have read the Torah, you don't have to, whatever it is, right? This whole list of things. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing, but I find it funny because then suddenly, like, here you have four religious leaders with vastly different practices, I think vastly different approaches to text, to ritual, to, right? But that's getting, right, that gets kind of flattened because we've done away, because as a Jewish community, it's not about, do you keep kosher or not? Because we don't all do that. So that can't be what unites us. And it can't be, do you believe in God? Because we don't all believe in God. So that can't be what unites us. And for a period of time, Israel was easy because there was consensus around Israel. And now we're struggling because now parts of our community don't feel that same connection to Israel, but we've also sort of thrown away, I would argue, right? I think we've thrown away these other things, even as personally, right? Like, I have a Shabbat practice and I have a Kashrut practice, but like we don't, right? You'd come together for like the Israel Bonds dinner. You don't come together for like a big Federation Torah study. That's not what we do as a community. And I think we're struggling because we've sort of thrown out, not literally, but we've set aside parts of our community. We've invested heavily, and now we need to maintain that because I think there's a fear of what's at risk, right? If we lose that, then what actually brings us together?
And I think, so, Rori, you're pointing out, what is it that we're looking for? We're looking for something that will unify us, a unifying principle, a mechaneh meshutaf, something that we would say we all stand for this and agree. And it's clear to us in watching these videos and listening to one another that parts of the Zionist enterprise, right, the experiment, which all of us support in different kinds of ways, right, is not working the way in which it used to work once upon a time. And there are a wide variety of reasons for that, but we know that it's not there. So I want to give Rabbi Daniel a chance to kind of say a word or two on this. And then I did want to get to, if not now, since I kind of conflated them because I'm looking at my notes without my glasses on.
So I actually think if we look at those videos, there were 3 different organizations that we talked about in those videos. Yep. We had, if not now, we had Nutari Karta, but we also had AIPAC referenced, right? And I want to talk about a different way of framing all of this, which is, it strikes me that one of the objections I have when I hear the Neturei Karta person speak is, I think actually they're abdicating responsibility for the power that we do have. It strikes me as like the same thing when I want to say, like, Trump's not my president. What I really mean by that is he is my president, right? And I'm just like washing, to borrow a metaphor, washing my hands of that, right? And look, I'm gonna push back and say something a little controversial here, maybe. I think AIPAC does that pretty consistently too. I think AIPAC has, over particularly the last 20 years, but longer than that probably, framed itself in a position that causes us as American Jews not to take moral responsibility for the power and the influence that we have. You know, I mentioned this last time, and maybe there's a little glimmer of a hope thanks to the UAE and the Israel deal, but that I no longer really believe that a two-state solution is possible. I hope I'm really wrong on that, but I fear that when the sort of history book on how we wasted the Zionist project is written, that AIPAC's going to get a whole long section of the ways that they helped to enable the very worst behavior and the worst instincts of Israeli society and the Israeli government. And I think so much of it is about an unwillingness to take moral responsibility for the power that we do have.
I appreciate all of this. Yeah.
Can I derail you a little bit, Carnie, and
sure.
Continue with this a bit? Because I think this actually goes back. I think, Daniel, you ended us last time with a question that I think is really like the fundamental question, and I don't remember exactly how you had framed it, but in a way, I think like it's sort of a question of like, what is the Zionist project itself, right? Like, and I think you had sort of posed, right? Like, if the Zionist project was establishing a Jewish state in the ancestral homeland of Jewish people, then like, check box, like we're done, like we, but because I want to say, because I think to what you just said, I think that depends on the answer to your question, right? Like, I think you're posing a Zionist project, and I think that this is true for many Jews in America. I think it's a Zionist project that is a very American Jewish Zionist project of a Jewish state in our ancestral homeland that lives up to the utmost values of who we want to represent as a Jewish people.
Roy, that's what they said themselves. They said it themselves.
And that's not quite what I'm saying. I think I agree with that, but that's not quite what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that American Jews have real power and influence that we refuse to take moral responsibility for. I'm not talking about Israel's actions. I'm actually talking about American Jewish actions and the power that we have.
Well, I think to your last point, when you said in terms of like the ways that like AIPAC will be remembered in terms of then how Israel lived out. Look, yes, I mean, I don't know. I also feel like there's a certain sense of like, what is it that we say versus what is it that we do? Like, yes, I know that was always the aspirational goal in many ways. But again, I think I sit with a bit of a tension. I think there's this, because I share that also. And I think it's very much an American, right? I share this kind of aspirational goal in terms of like, what is it, right? If there's one state in the world that represents the Jewish people, I want it to be the very best possible state that it absolutely could be. And what does it also mean to be a political entity, to be a national entity, to live in a world stage where you're, and so
it doesn't mean being immoral. Sorry to interrupt, Rory, but it doesn't mean being immoral.
I'm not saying to be immoral. I'm not at all advocating for being immoral. What I'm saying though is that I think this is where we start to get to the tension of when do we become anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, and when do we as Jews also, right, have a different engagement in terms of rights. This is also like who gets to criticize your family, and then you get to criticize your family but someone else doesn't, right? And so I think like, what does it mean to what does it mean for me as Jews to want Israel to live up to its absolute best possible values? I want that. What is it also though to recognize, right? I also don't believe that nation states in the world, when they don't live up to their values, get eliminated as nation states, right? Like I think all of us kind of agree, right? Like France doesn't
we can
go
never lose the aspiration. I want to stop here because I'm the timekeeper today, unfortunately, and there's so much more that we could say here. I do want to just put one plug in that I actually think, Daniel, that over the course of time, that AIPAC itself is being changed from the inside because in part of the next generation of young people who are influencing what's happening within AIPAC. And I think the AIPAC of today is a very different AIPAC than we may have encountered in a previous era. And I say that as a supporter of AIPAC to a certain extent, and as one from the inside who's trying to make that kind of change and difference. I want to go to the one state solution issue. I was going to go to a different piece, but I'd like to put up Peter Beinart, if that's okay, because I think Peter Beinart's voice here is a very important one. Right, Peter Beinart, some of you have read what he's written, and hopefully Daniel will be able to get this up for us. This whole notion of moving away, right, is it the end of the Zionist project of a Jewish homeland, right, a place for Jews, or is it time that we abandon this? And by the way, it's not brand new, but the notion of a binational state or a democratic state that will be available to all. So a little bit from Peter Beinart. We're not going to watch all of it because it's quite long.
Carnie, do you want me to start at the beginning, or?
I think you should start at the beginning just for the context, and then we'll shut it down at a certain point. I think we'll have the points. Though I think the end has some wonderful. If you get to watch the clip later, there's some important stuff that happens at the end. Even Beinart himself kind of recreating what Beinart is saying towards the end of the interview.
And just an apology to everyone out there. This is the one most likely to have audio problems, but we will see.
Although the Trump administration's Middle East peace plan said its goal was a realistic two-state solution, most who know the region well saw quickly that such a solution wasn't really possible under that plan. For starters, the Palestinians have long said they need a significant amount of sovereignty and a significant amount of land to live in peace. The plan offers them less of either than previous plans that had fizzled. So, if the two-state solution is in trouble, what is the next alternative? Peter Beinart has an idea that was published in Jewish Currents, where he is an editor-at-large. He's also a contributor at The Atlantic and at CNN. Peter, let me start by asking you, the premise of your argument is that the two-state solution is dead. And while people might feel like this administration has put forward a bad plan or there were other problems, I think there are a lot of people who are still going to say, no, the goal is still two states, Israel and Palestine, living separately, side by side, in peace and security. Why did you come to the conclusion that that basic idea that you had believed in your whole life is now essentially dead?
Reed, I've been hearing people saying that the two-state solution is on the verge of death my entire adult life. In 1982, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, who knew the situation on the ground better than almost all Israelis, said that if there were 100,000 settlers in the West Bank, it would be impossible to create a viable and contiguous Palestinian state. There are now 650,000 settlers. Two of Israel's Supreme Court justices live in the West Bank. Its second most powerful politician, arguably, Avigdor Lieberman, lives there. Israel built its newest medical school last year in the West Bank. At a certain point, those of us who have supported a two-state solution and have been saying for years and years it's on the verge of death, as Thomas Friedman did in 2003, as John Kerry did in 2013, have to recognize that the egg cannot be unscrambled, and the price of continuing to imagine that there can be a two-state solution is in reality the acceptance of a status quo that leaves millions of Palestinians without the most basic of human rights.
And so the reality that you're describing is a reality of continued Israeli occupation and settlement of parts of the West Bank, and particularly one should note the parts that are habitable, right? There are large parts of the West Bank that are being given, but a lot of that is desert.
Absolutely. If you look at the Trump plan and even an earlier plans, what you essentially imagine is that there would be a kind of archipelago of disconnected Palestinian towns that might be connected by, tunnels or roads, with Israel controlling the land in between. That doesn't provide the basic dignity and opportunity for security and prosperity that Palestinians, like all people, deserve. And that's why I have to say reluctantly, after a lot of kind of soul searching, began to think about alternatives. And as I read more and more, I began to think that that equality could be a viable and even liberating alternative, not only for Palestinians, but for Jews too.
So explain how that would work. One state that encompasses all of Israel, the West Bank, even Gaza, and normal voting for everybody. In other words, everybody has the same vote, in which case, what kind of government do you imagine?
Well, it could either be one state that gave a lot of autonomy to different regions where different groups live, or it could be a confederation, which would be two states but allowed free movement, a little bit like what you have in the European Union. I know it's hard for many people to imagine that a binational state, a state that encompasses two different national identities, can work. But it's important to remember that Israel is already a binational state. Israel controls all of the territory in the West Bank and even in Gaza, where Israel controls who comes and who goes. And what we know from political science research is that deeply divided societies are more stable and more peaceful when everyone has a voice in government. That's why the violence in Northern Ireland stopped when Catholics gained a vote in government. It's why the political violence in South Africa from the ANC and others stopped when apartheid ended. I think that although a equal binational state would be messy and complicated and difficult in many ways, it would actually be a more stable and peaceful place for Palestinians and for Jews than one state in which millions of people lack basic rights.
So a lot of people would argue with you and have argued with you that Times of Israel has a very long piece refuting your arguments. And sort of one of the central arguments against your case is the Palestinians. You assume that the Palestinians would accept this. You assume that the Palestinians would accept Israel, that they do not seek the destruction of the Jewish people and the Jewish state. And people argue there's a lot of evidence to the contrary.
I think that again, what we know from other conflicts is that oppression produces violence and that justice and equality produces more peace. And I actually think there's evidence of this in Israel-Palestine too. Look at the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They're sometimes called Arab Israelis. They suffer significant discrimination, but they have the right to vote. Violence against Jews by Israeli Palestinian citizens, even though they have much more access to commit violence against Jews, is very, very, very rare. And I think that's because Palestinians are acting like other human beings. When you give people the right to express themselves in non-violent ways, by voting, by expressing their opinions, very, very few people want to kill or be killed. And I think it's the dehumanization of Palestinians that unfortunately has affected Jewish discourse so much that prevents us from seeing that that's true about them too.
Do you think there are people who say this is kind of a fantasy, this is utopian, it's just impossible to imagine something like this? How unrealistic is this?
It's unrealistic today, but the two-state solution is also unrealistic. Great moral changes almost always appear unrealistic early on before there is a vast movement for change. Look at how Black Lives Matter, that movement, in a few months has made things that seemed completely unrealistic seem now politically possible. The advantage of equality, which is the same message as the Black Lives Matter movement has brought to the US, the same message as the anti-apartheid movement, is that it is a message compelling enough to produce a mass movement on the ground and around the world that can change what is politically possible. The two-state solution, which now means a fragmented Palestinian state under Israeli control, is no longer a compelling enough vision to bring about that movement for change.
Rabbi Daniel, I think this is the place to stop.
Some of the
we could watch that for a lot longer, and there's much more there that's worth considering. Hopefully you can watch it on your own. We're kind of getting to the end of our time together, so I wanted to make sure that the panelists had an opportunity to reflect upon Peter Beinart and some other thoughts. So Rabbi Bennett, I think I cut you off the last time, so I'll give you the first word here, and maybe go back. Somebody was asking you to go back over.
Yeah, I'm not certain what I was saying then, so I'm
sure it was genius.
I'm sure it was brilliant and correct also. But, as far as Peter Beinart, look, I am a huge optimist and a believer in the possibility of the two-state solution. I have not abandoned that aspiration and that dream, although he makes very compelling arguments, and I think only time and history will tell. But I'd like to believe that the fundamental rightness and correctness of the vision of a true two-state solution is still the best hope for peace and for justice for all people, not only for the Jewish people, not only for the Palestinians, but for everyone. And I think Peter Beinart makes really compelling and intellectually solid arguments. I just don't personally, I'm not willing personally to go there yet. I understand why he does. I think he's abandoning hope, and I don't want to abandon hope. That's all I'll say about that. And in response, earlier to what you were saying, Rory, I think that the Jewish people have the right to keep hope alive as well. And I think the founders of the modern state of Israel really believed in the vision that they inscribed in the Declaration of Independence for this new country. And we shouldn't, because it's hard, we shouldn't give up on it. That's all. I'll stop there.
Very good. Thank you so much. Rabbi Bogard, something to throw in?
So what I find really interesting about Beinart and this piece, if people haven't read it, if you Google Yavne, Y-A-V-N-E, and Beinart, you'll be able to find the long form piece in Jewish Currents.
Maybe say a word about why it's called Yavne so people have a context, Rabbi?
Yeah, so right, there's this incredible story from the Talmud about how basically Judaism was saved, right? We're all in Jerusalem, we're being destroyed, and we get this whole incredible story of sneaking out in a coffin. But Yavne becomes the city where the yeshiva was, where Judaism was promulgated out of, where there was sort of a shard that could enable everything to be rebuilt. So Beinart plays with that, is in that. But look, what I find interesting about Beinart is that he is saying out loud in a very public forum the sorts of things that I have been hearing in all sorts of Jewish spaces when sort of Jewish leadership folks are around and there aren't other people listening. I hear it from liberals, I hear it from conservatives, I hear it across the Jewish spectrum, this fear that the two-state solution is no longer a real possibility, that it is turned into a veneer for foreign policy and for enabling an ongoing occupation, all of these things. But again, what I find so interesting is that Beinart, someone in his position, is saying it out loud, right? Like if he's saying it, how much longer will it be until Jeffrey Goldberg is writing that, until Thomas Friedman is writing it, so on and so forth. But I actually want to go back a little bit to the previous conversation because it does connect to Beinart, which is that his book, Crisis of Zionism, which came out in 2008, was one of those books that just kind of transformed me. It's about American Jewry and its relationship to Israel and AIPAC and some of those things I said before. And I definitely was going to say something. Oh, but one of the pieces that Beinart really raises there that I think is so important to understand too is the way that so many Jewish institutions, and this goes back to what you were saying about AIPAC, Carnie, over the last 20 years or so, have stopped representing American Jews. What has happened is, as sort of Jews have seen income inequality and wealth inequality in the same way everyone else in America has, what's happened is, by and large, our ultra-wealthy liberal donors give to universalist causes, wonderful universalist causes to improve the world, and our ultra-wealthy conservative Jews give to Jewish organizations. And so what's happened is that increasingly more and more of our Jewish organizations, from our federations to our JCRCs to our synagogues to everywhere you look, are funded and supported by a donor class that is significantly to the right of any representative sort of spectrum of what American Jews really think. I would suggest actually that J Street represents much closer to what most American Jews tend to think when you look at polls of what American Jews think about Israel and Palestine. And yet they are portrayed as sort of outside of the reasonable spectrum of Jewish conversation and so on and so forth, where AIPAC, I would suggest, has become really something that is controlled to a large extent by an ever dwindling number of ever more conservative, ever more right-wing, ever more Republican Jewish donors.
By the way, I'm just going to jump in with one thing, and then Rori, when we're kind of getting close to the end of the time. But the question I want to ask is, you mentioned a number of authors and writers. You didn't mention J Street, by the way, when it came to Beinart. In other words, the question would be, how long will it be before J Street becomes the platform that, or endorses the platform that Peter Beinart has suggested. So I'd be interested in that. And I think that Rabbi Bennett also wants to say something, and then maybe Maharat, Rori.
You want to go
Daniel,
first, Jim?
did you want to respond?
No, Carnie, I think you're saying exactly what I'm saying. I don't have an answer to that, but that's exactly the point. Like, if Beinart's saying it now, how long will it be until mainstream Jewish organizations, also mainstream center left, or organizations that represent fairly mainstream American Jews, are also saying these sorts of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think J Street, at least for the foreseeable future, has deeply enshrined a commitment to this aspirational vision of a two-state solution. Whether that evolves over time with new leadership, perhaps. Peter Beinart is an ally of and very active in the J Street dialogue, so who knows? I think we can only speculate. The other thing I wanted to just really quickly say before, Rori, you jump back in here, is the question was asked earlier about President Trump's statement yesterday about him having done Jerusalem for the evangelicals. And I think it's important to lift that up as a reminder that President Trump and others are not really interested in the aspirational vision of Israel. They're interested in Israel being used as a political tool to further other goals. And this is a blatant example of that. The support of Israel for the annexation of the West Bank, the support of evangelicals for the annexation of the West Bank, or for moving the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, or affirming that, those are not in the best interest of the aspirational vision of Judaism, of the mainstream American Jewish community for Israel today. They're not good for Israel, but they're good for politics for people like President Trump. And I think we need to be honest and differentiate and listen to our people, listen to ourselves, and not get caught up in blind fervor for this misguided support for an Israel that we don't support. Rori, I'll turn it over to you.
So, look, I'm with you, Jim, in terms of, like, I still do have a hope. I mean, I do. I think that's actually always been the nature of Israel, has been, I think, like, a big part of the Zionist endeavor has always been taking the impossible and making it possible. I remember talking to an Israeli politician a number of years ago who said, that was always what we sought to do, and I don't know when we stopped believing it, and we should never stop believing it. We never would have thought, 100 years ago, who could have imagined this conversation and the extent to which, and all of that. And so, we should never stop striving for that. And so I do still believe in it. And frankly, I also feel like I have the luxury. I don't need to actually give the solution, right? Like I can talk about aspirations, and I don't need it to then conclude with one state or two state or whatever it is. Like that, I leave that. There's a reason why I didn't go into politics. I became a religious leader. I could talk about aspirations. I don't have to actually talk about real life solutions. But I think just to kind of bring us, I think, to where I think, the platform of this conversation in terms of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, I think it's important. I don't disagree with in much of what you're all saying, but I think it's important to recognize that even as I can still speak from the personal about what I see as aspirational, we also need to see facts on the ground. And when I say facts on the ground, I don't mean put up my hands and say there's nothing that I could do about it. But I think it becomes really hard when we start having these conversations, right? That like I can push and advocate for Israel to live up to what I believe are the best Jewish values, and others might have different opinions on what they think the best Jewish values are. But I think that also gets like really complicated when we start talking about, when people then start saying like, well, why does the UN condemn Israel more than it condemns other countries or things like that, right? And I have like huge wrestling with that, because on the one hand, I hate the argument. I don't want to be like Israel, like one step above Saudi Arabia. Like that's not my goal, right? Like I feel like that becomes their argument. Like how come they condemn Israel but they don't condemn these other countries? And I don't want to be like the best of the human rights violators. Like that's not what I'm aspiring for, right? But like we have to talk about Israel also as a political entity, because I think that's again where we start to then get into those lines, because I can talk about what I want Israel to aspire to. Somebody can criticize Israel for what it does as a political entity, or for not living up to its aspirations. And then I think there's a line to what happens when we are to a despising of Israel purely as a Jewish state? Because I think when we start blurring all of those lines, that's where we start getting really dangerously into anti-Semitism. And I don't think this happened in any one of the clips today, but I will say I have even experienced within Jewish groups that criticize Israel ways that they have used anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semitic language in criticism of Israel that becomes
often
really
unbeknownst to them.
Unbeknownst, absolutely.
Right.
That's
they
a
don't
good,
even
that's
realize
a
it.
good
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I want to like kind of go back that when I reference it as a political entity, I think it's important not because I think like to kind of like dismiss it as, but to recognize that I think like Israel is both, as an American Jew, I can hold Israel up for my Jewish values, but then I also have to recognize that like when the Israeli government is going to negotiate peace negotiations with various other entities, they're going to do so on a political basis, or they're going to make an economic trade agreement with a country that I also find to have human rights violations.
Look at the
and
UAE
that's political, right? Exactly what you're
Like,
saying.
if you
Right?
look at this deal and you think Israel is the problematic human rights partner, I think that's a pretty good test that you're seeing a pretty distorted.
Exactly. And that's what, so I want to say like, and I'm a big believer, this is like the both and for me. This is like the elu ve'elu, right? Like that like I can simultaneously strive for Israel to be the best that I believe Israel can be in what I see as my Jewish values, and also recognize that Israel is a political entity that is going to operate on a political field. And so for me, there's like here's where my aspirations are, here's all the ways that like legitimately Israel is sort of going to screw up because it's a political entity, and then here's where like we've crossed over the line to anti-Semitism. And I want to be really careful because like, you know, not living up to its aspirations is not when we become anti-Semitic, right? And criticism of Israel for its aspirations is legitimate. Like, I don't need to say I have to criticize every human rights violating country equally. I have a connection and an investment in Israel that is different than any other country, and I will speak out about it differently than I will about other countries. And that has to be distinct from when do we then cross over into illegitimate criticism.
I would just add, since you went that direction, I would also add that I would go in the other direction too, vis-a-vis love of Israel and support of Israel. That just as I will hold Israel to a higher standard on the one hand, I will also be more understanding of Israel on the other, at least for me. That I need to say that my love for the state of Israel allows for me, right? Like they say that people who love one another can sleep on a bed that's 250 amma by 250 amma, right? I can live with this tension and this reality, just as I can chastise and I can critique. I can also love in a deeper and a stronger and an unending way. My love for Israel will not end. That was what was so sad for me in the Beinart clip. I don't think it comes out of lack of love, but I think he has lost hope. I think he has sort of fallen out of love. And I still have so much of that dreamy love that I think started with the chalutzim that Rabbi Bennett alluded to. Rabbi Bennett, it looks like you want a word in there too, and then maybe about Rabbi Bogard.
Sorry, Jim, were you going to?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Look, I also think that emotions like love, particularly dreamy love, right? We can get trapped in mythologies that enable the continuation of really damaging things. I think it's the same way that mythologies of American exceptionalism can't be disconnected from white supremacy and our white supremacist society. I
but
also
fully demythologizing also has a great danger to it. If I no longer have the myth that my wife is the only woman for me, that's a dangerous reality to live with.
I'm with you, and I know that one of the things that has happened to me as sort of a confluence of Donald Trump and taking the wrong job is that like the myths all came crashing down for me to a large extent. But I also think that a dreamy love and hope of a two-state solution can also serve to make us agents who are serving basically as a veil, a human rights veil for abuses. And even more so, they prevent us as American Jews and frankly our cousins and siblings as Israelis from taking moral responsibility for the power that we really do have.
And knowing that we will continue this dialogue next week and hopefully have a chance for our listeners and our participants to dialogue more and even ask us some kind of wrap-up questions, I did just want to make a really quick point that, you know, many of us have felt very angered by the accusations that if you don't support America and the current administration in America, you are anti-American. I think we need to be cautious about not accusing those who are critical of Israel of being anti-Semitic just because we may be critical of Israel. And maybe we all ought to take a deep breath and be more interested in the shared vision that we as Americans have, that we as Jews for Israel, supporters of Israel have, and stop looking for reasons to separate ourselves and to divide, and instead look for reasons to unite, both in this nation and in Israel. And maybe that's where this is all headed for us as a community. So I look forward to continuing that.
Thank you. We are going to end a session because the Maharat has another session that she needs to be
say goodbye.
facilitating. So thank you so much to everybody. I want to thank everybody for participating. I do want to end with the following idea, I think, which emerges from this conversation, that anti-Zionism is not always anti-Semitism. There are times when anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, but it is not always the case. I see that as a direct question here that needs to be answered. I think also that we are beginning to understand that there are many voices in our community, and it is our obligation and responsibility, despite what the Maharat said about being religious leaders and we're not supposed to be so engaged and involved that way, to say that we do have an obligation and responsibility to lift up the voices of those that are speaking in our community and give them a platform even when we disagree with them. Maybe especially when we disagree with them, because a certain sense of humility demands that we listen to what others have to say, because you know what? We might actually learn something from one another. The Talmud says you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. You know, listen twice as much as you talk. And so I hope that we'll have a chance to listen to one another, not castigate one another, not cast aspersions on one another when we tend to disagree about particular nuances. And again, I want to echo the very wise words that Rabbi Bennett said, that we're in this together. And we need to remember that we're in this together, whether we live in Israel, whether we live in the diaspora, whether we're right wing or left wing, whether we want 1-state solution, 2-state solution, whatever it is that we want, we're all doing this because we're trying to live out our Jewish values. And so I feel particularly blessed to have had the opportunity to do this with these good folks for the last few weeks. We're going to send out a video that I think is very important. It is from our teachers, Yossi Klein Halevi, who is an author, as well as Yehuda Kurtzer, who is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. It's a discussion between the two of them, a little bit of a debate, and we'll send it out so people can watch it on their own. It's only about 27 minutes long. Rabbi Bogard, if we could trouble you to send that out or make it available to people?
We will look into this. It's behind the login wall for Hartman. So I got to figure out how we can share that other than here, but we'll figure something out, even if we just run it as a precursor or after next week's session or something.
But I think it's an important session, and I think one of the pieces that come across is that there are, and I'm seeing this question being asked over and over again, generational attitudes here. Right? There are certain folks of a certain age, of a certain orientation, based on the fact that they lived through certain eras. And the next generation of folks may have a somewhat different orientation. And we need to remember that we are not only building a Jewish community for today, we're building a Jewish community for perpetuity, Leolam Va'ed. And that's our responsibility and obligation. And so we have to make sure to hear those voices as well. Rabbi Bennett, anything to close?
No, I look forward to people bringing their questions next week. We'll do our best to have some Q&A and discussion with our participants, and watch your email for more information about next week.
Fantastic. Thank you. Rabbi Bogard, anything?
If you're seeing this on Facebook or YouTube, it means I successfully uploaded it later. So we're living in the future.
We are the people of hope, so we hope it all worked out well. I want to thank everybody. I sort of feel like we should sing to finish, but we won't do that unless, Rabbi Bogard, you actually have that wonderful David Rosa song available to you. We could stick it up there. But one way or another, we thank everybody. We are looking forward to next week when Rabbi Bennett will be the facilitator and will be the respondents. And again, I'm seeing this. Can you continue this? We'll have that conversation internally. I think it would be a very good idea to continue, maybe bring some other voices to join us as well, or maybe tackle other very specific issues. But I'm really looking forward to next week when everybody will have a chance to shoot all the questions, and Rabbi Bennett will give you all the correct answers. Okay, everybody. Chodesh Tov. Have a good new month. It's starting soon. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, everybody. Shalom, Chavirim. Shalom.